Okay, now I know that's not on right. I think it should be down a little bit lower, but this thing has fallen off like 11 times, so let's just go with it. Hey everybody, Tekking101 here, and welcome to my discussion video on RORONOA ZORO, or possibly Zolo, depends on what translation you're reading. I'm really excited for this one. I know you guys are really pumped for this one. This is a big one, not just a member of the Strawhat crew, not just one of the members that have been around for the longest time. Honestly, the first member of the Strawhat crew, if you don't count Luffy, because, you know, he's the one that kind of, you know, founded it, so the first person to join the crew. Has been in the series since like chapter 3, which just adds to more stuff that I could forget, and has obviously contributed a lot. So his and Luffy's are the videos that I hope that are going to be the longest out of this whole list, and, you know, the ones that I expand upon the most. Not that, like, you know, Usopp's been on the crew for a long time too, but, you know, Zoro's just been in more battles, and he's had, you know, more screen time than Usopp. Sorry, Usopp, you know. But yeah, we got a lot of stuff here. We got all of Zoro's katanas back here. We got some sake. I went to a convention on Saturday. I got this badass figurine here of Zoro, so I think we're set. Let's just start by his position on the crew. Let's just start with that, because honestly, he doesn't really fulfill a lot of duties while on the ship. So, Zoro's position, and it might seem obvious to a lot of people, like if I ask you what is Zoro's position on the ship, aside from just saying, oh, he's just the swordsman, because that's kind of a vague position. No, you would say he's the first mate, he's the vice captain, he's the second in command after Luffy, as Rayleigh was to Roger. But it's funny because he doesn't really fulfill that duty at all. If he's the first mate, you'd figure, okay, so he's the one that orders the crew around when the captain is unable to, or he's the one that takes charge, or issues like the day-to-day activities, or anything like that. Zoro doesn't do anything like that. When he's on the ship, he's either asleep, fucking drunk, or he's up at the top of the crow's nest in the ship, you know, working out, you know, lifting like 6-ton freaking dumbbells or whatever. He doesn't order people around. He doesn't tell what them to do or stuff. He might get mildly annoyed at people, but that's it. That's honestly more of Nami's thing. And considering Luffy is Luffy, Nami's pretty much the acting captain whenever they're on the ship. She's the one that are like, okay, let's go here, tip the mainsails, you swabs. I don't know pirate talk. But yeah, so Zoro doesn't really have any official duties while on the ship. But that doesn't mean he's not important. In fact, he's one of the strongest members of the crew. He's part of the monster trio, with Luffy being the captain, of course, Zoro first mate, and Sanji the cook, the three strongest members of the Straw Hat crew. And that'll start debate for as long as freaking time itself exists. You know, who is stronger, Zoro or Luffy? And they had a fight once at one point in the story during Whiskey Peak, but that was back in, like, I don't know, chapter 110. That was right after the end of the Grand Line, so it was cool to see them fight there, but the fight didn't really last all that long. It was pretty much a draw, and after they weren't fighting to the death or anything. They was just a misunderstanding. There hasn't been a confrontation between Luffy and Zoro since then. So I don't think we're ever going to really have a determination to find out who's stronger. Hey, look, all I'm saying is, you know, Luffy's got Gear 4th, and that's, you know, King Kong gun, and, you know, that would be pretty hard to take a hit from that, but let me see Luffy take a fucking Ichidai Sansen Daisen Sakai right to the fucking face and see how Luffy feels after that. Same thing with, like, let's see Zoro take a King Kong gun to the face and see how he can stand that. Zoro's shown incredible amounts of durability in this story. In fact, there's one scene that I don't even understand how he survived. I just don't get it. He's built out of fucking adamantium. I don't know. You know, Hugh Jackman would have a freaking run for his money with Zoro. I don't know. But yeah, so the official position, though, is first mate, I guess, but more often than not, just he's the muscle. He's the swordsman of the group. His title is actually the Pirate Hunter, because Zoro was actually a bounty hunter going around the East Blue area, you know, defeating pirates and, you know, getting money, and just, that's, you know, he was basically just like a ronin, like a wandering samurai without a master, essentially, just wandering the lands and taking out pirates. There was actually one filler episode that actually showcases Zoro being a bounty hunter, and this is the episode where he meets, like, Johnny and Yosaku. And filler is, you know, it's hit or miss sometimes, but with One Piece there's not that many of it, and I would really highly recommend checking out that episode, because you get to see what Zoro was doing before he joined the crew, and the kind of life he led and stuff like that, and how he met Johnny and Yosaku. It was a good episode. Also, it features the most amazing, most intense villain ever in One Piece. Doflamingo, the Gorosei, Akainu have nothing on Wicked Dick. And I feel like he just gets no love whatsoever. I mean, come on now. Zoro fought against him and basically cut off his dick. Yeah, go watch the episode. I'm not kidding you here. But enough about filler. Moving on to Zoro's relationship with the crew, his personality, so to speak. So, Zoro is, he's a pretty stoic guy the first time you look at him. In fact, when Kobe was talking about him in Chapter 2, when he was telling him about this guy, Zoro is imprisoned at Shelltown, and that's what got Luffy interested in going and meeting him and asking him to be the first person to join his crew, because he seemed like a strong guy. He referred to him as, like, a demon. Sort of, a demon that wields 3 swords that'll cut you down. And, so we first meet Zoro, and he's tied to this post, hasn't had anything to eat for, like, a month at that point, so he looks like he's about to pass out, but he still has this, like, very stern face on him, and so we think he's rather intimidating. But he's not just this really stern guy that's like, fuck off, I'm Zoro, all I care about's fighting. Which, a lot of other anime characters can fall into that sort of, that mire of a character development. But, Zoro's not like that, no. And he's very prideful. One would say he sort of follows the traditional Japanese, rule of, like, Bushido, the way of the swordsman, stuff like that. So he's very prideful. He'll never attack somebody with his back turned unless, like, it's like a life or death fucking, like, the entire crew gets wiped out sort of situation. But other than that, he'll try to fight his opponent very fairly, and, won't do anything like dirty tricks or anything like that, because his pride as a swordsman will be, on the chopping block there. Along with that, he believes that, the scars on the back are a swordsman's shame. So, we'll get to that when we get to, Mihawk and everything like that. But that's just the kind of guy he is. He doesn't pull any punches, but, does it as fairly as possible. So, another thing that's huge is his relationship to Luffy. So, I think it goes beyond just Luffy, and let me tell you in a second here. So, Luffy meets him, and it's through, his interaction with Luffy that he was freed from Shelltown, that they managed to defeat Morgan and get, Kobe rescued from Helm Eppo and everything like that. And so Zoro decides, out of gratitude for Luffy, to join his crew. But throughout the story, it's shown a lot of times that it seems that Zoro, while he does have great admiration for Luffy, and while he does genuinely believe that Luffy is going to be the king of the pirates, it seems that he has much more of a admiration for the captain position, the status that Luffy represents as a captain. Now, Luffy is not the best captain in terms of, like I said, with direction. In terms of actually ordering the crew, in terms of, like, oh shit, guys, we're on the seas and a giant tidal wave's coming. What do we do? In some cases, Luffy will be freaking out, or he'll be just like, oh my god, this is so cool. So like I said, we're not talking about captain in that respect, but we're talking about a guy you can rely on. When the chips are down, when someone that's actually going to represent the leader, the person that's going to take us and become one of the strongest pirate crews in the world, someone that's going to become king of the pirates, that's what Luffy represents. And sometimes Zoro will actually hold Luffy's feet to the fire with that position. When you had Usopp leave the crew, and then at the end of the Enies Lobby arc, during the post Enies Lobby arc, when everybody's in Water 7, Luffy's like, oh, I'm just going to accept Usopp back into the crew. And Zoro's like, oh, the fuck you're not. I am not going to respect a cap. He mouthed off to you, and then he fought you. This is a member of your crew that you fought against. That's not what you do to your captain. And we can accept him back if he actually gets on his hands and knees and he apologizes for what he did. But if you're just going to bring him back on the crew just because, oh, he's our friend, blah, 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 then fuck that. I'm not going to respect you as a captain, and I'll be the next person to walk. So he does respect Luffy, but he respects the position of what Luffy represents, and will hold him to that. Like, you're going to be king of the pirates, you're going to be the captain of this crew, then you better be fucking deserving of my respect. And considering how strong Zoro is, it's not probably very easy to win his respect. So that's the way it is with Luffy. They're still really good friends that they can rely on and stuff, but Luffy really has to remember his position. Especially since, honestly, when a lot of people first meet Zoro and they see all the shit he's capable of and how strong he is, they immediately assume Zoro is the captain of the Straw Hat crew. And, that Luffy is just his subordinate. So, Luffy really has to keep in mind that status that he has, and how many, there's like a lot of strong people on his crew, but he has to be the one to lead them all. So that's the case. That's the situation it is with Luffy and Zoro. And of course, the one more thing I have to mention with Luffy's relationship, and Zoro's relationship to Luffy, probably probably the shining moment of Zoro's entire character so far in the story. I mean, there's been some pretty... I mean, I'm not talking about, like, there's badass moments, you know, moments where Zoro will, like, jump into the sky at, like, Mach 1 and then fucking cut a giant mountain rock guy in half. I mean, that's pretty awesome, and it's like, oh my god, he's so cool. But then you get moments that don't have to deal with just cutting a mofo up. Moments that actually deal with, you know, who he is as a character and the lengths that he'll go to. And there's no moment, and everyone knows what I'm going to talk about. If you don't know what the fuck I'm going to bring up, then you're not a real fan of One Piece, or you just haven't gotten to that point yet. It's the moment on Thriller Bark when all the Straw Hats, save for Zoro and Sanji, are blasted and knocked out by Kuma. And Kuma is walking very slowly over to... I watched this episode earlier today just to get in the mood to do this. Kuma, the first, like, 5 minutes of that episode are no dialogue, no music, no nothing. It's very ominous. Everyone's lying defeated. Kuma just slowly walks over to Luffy, picks up Luffy, is about to pick up Luffy to kill him, to take his head. Because that's what the government ordered, you know, go and kill Straw Hat Luffy. He took out Moria. He's a big problem. You have to kill him. So Kuma, very loyal member of the Warlords, goes over and is ready to do it. Zoro springs in at the last minute, cuts up Kuma, throws down his swords, and makes the offer that I can't let you take my captain's head. If you need a head to take mine. I know my bounty's not as high as Luffy. I know that the government doesn't treat me as much of a threat as Luffy. But I, rest assured, would have been the man that would have been the greatest swordsman in the world. And Kuma just looks at him and he's like, you have such ambition, and yet you're willing to throw it all away for him. And Zoro was like, damn straight I am, because if I can't protect my crew, then what's good of my ambitions? And as Mihawk said himself, because he has a similar moment with Mihawk, another really good moment with Zoro, where he's bowing before the person that he actually wants to defeat, and has to ask Mihawk to train him. Mihawk says, wow, I guess you must have found someone, that Straw Hat Luffy, you must have found his ambitions to be more worthy of you bowing before me than your own ambitions. You put your own shit aside for him. So, yeah, maybe it's because Zoro sees a little bit of himself in Luffy, how Zoro, you know, he wants to be the greatest swordsman in the world and to surpass Mihawk, which is honestly a very difficult prospect. You know, not a lot of people probably believed him in that idea, considering how freaky strong Mihawk is. And so he sees Luffy, who's like, fuck, I'm going to be the king of the pirates, which is an equally ridiculous kind of claim that just anybody in the middle of the East Blue would be making. So maybe that's part of the reason. And that's one of the reasons why he wants Luffy to get stronger. He wants Luffy's ambitions to carry on, that he's going to be a support for that, and how he wants to always keep his captain in mind of his captain position. Because he sees a little bit of himself in there, and he's like, I'm not, only give up your ambition if you find something greater than that. And Zoro's found that. He was willing to die. And I still don't know how he didn't. I mean, obviously main character, so he can't, but I obviously have no idea how he did that. He was already pretty much at death's door, and then he absorbs all the injuries and exhaustion and fatigue that Luffy had in the fight with Moria and Oars, and Kuma's like, yeah, there's no way you could survive this. And he survives this in probably the single most fucking badass Clint Eastwood, Chuck Norris, this side of America, with a freaking side of French fries and a triple Baconator from fucking Wendy's. I don't even know what some of those words meant, but in this moment, everybody, even if you weren't a fan of Zoro, you creamed your freaking pants. I'll tell you that right now. So yeah, I think that's pretty much all I have to say there. Moving on to his... Oh, that was just bound to happen. Alright, I'm not going to try to put it on again. Oop. Right, so moving on to Zoro's relationship with Nami. As I said, Nami really fulfills the role of, ordering around the crew as like a first mate would. Not even going beyond just navigation, just like when the crew's being lazy or they need to get their shit in gear, Nami's the one that'll usually, get them in moving around there. During the Arlong arc, there was a big moment with them. So, at first in the story, when Zoro, and Nami met, it wasn't that big of a deal. It was just like, oh, okay, she's going to be the navigator, all right, and Zoro might not have trusted her too much there. He says something very, vague during Arlong Park that I think is like, I never really trusted you, or something like that. And I think he actually just calls her a bitch later on during Arlong Park. It's like, I didn't really trust you, but God, you're such a heartless bitch that you would betray your crew members or something like that. But it's funny as a comparison, though, just because that, Nami is a navigator. She's really good at, getting her bearings and everything. Zoro has no sense of direction whatsoever. That's a running gag with his character. He's a freaking genius on the battlefield, and he has amazing eyesight. He's, during his fight with Pika, most notably, even with one eye, he was able to just, cut up Pika and, keep an eye out where he's going and, assimilating into the rock. So he has great eyesight, and he's great at battle, but he has absolutely no sense of direction. That's what's kind of funny about it, how he's so good at everything else, and yet this is just, like, one thing he loses on. What's funny is when he gets lost in situations that are like really dire, like when he gets lost during Sabaody and he ends up at the auction house where everyone was anyway, that kind of shit. And during when he was lost during like at Mihawk's place, which I think mostly was anime filler. But it's funny, like if you invited Zoro over to your house, and Zoro was like, I need to use the bathroom or whatever, and then you're just like, oh yeah, up the stairs, first door on the left. Zoro will end up in your fucking basement somehow. He'll find a way. But anyway, yeah, after the events on Arlong Park, and after it's realized that, Arlong was really the one that was controlling Nami, and she was just playing along for the sake of her family, for the sake of her village, for the sake of, just the memory of Bellamere and everything like that. So that was the case there. Luffy curb stomps the fuck out of Arlong. Although, cool scene, though. So in that arc, how you had Zoro take out Hachi, which, okay, fine. But then you had a scene where Luffy was, still trapped under the water. So it was up to Zoro and Sanji to face off against Arlong, eventually just Zoro, and he loses because of his injury. So it would have been interesting on how Zoro would have stacked up against Arlong back then if he didn't have the massive injury he just got from Mihawk. But one of the most intense scenes was when Arlong, this really freaking badass fishman that has seen a lot of crazy shit in his day, as we've seen later with the flashback with Fisher Tiger and Jinbei. This is a guy that has been a pirate himself, and he's seen some pretty grisly stuff. He's holding Zoro up by the freaking throat, sees all the bandages, and he's just like, oh, what are you hiding under there? Rips off the bandage, and then blood just splatters all over Arlong's face, and he sees the wound he got from Mihawk, and Arlong is just, like, visibly like, oh, jeez, how... This guy's like a torn-up rag doll. How are you even still standing right now? And he's looking at Zoro like he's a freaking zombie walking the earth long after he's dead or something. So that was a cool scene. But after Luffy curb stomps, Arlong, bends his freaking, nose penis or whatever, that's when Nami officially joins the crew and Zoro begins to trust her. There's many scenes where he cares for her well-being, as the time when she was sick. He tries to help out the crew as much as he can when she is, although this usually ends up in him like I remember the one scene when I guess that when she was sick and they were in the sea, I guess trying to find a doctor, and Nami's like, I have to figure out a way to go. And Zoro's like, oh no, I got it, don't worry. And he's like lifting a dumbbell and he's like, oh, I'm just following that cloud. And Nami's like, what? Clouds, they change constantly, appearance, and they're on the wind. Oh my god. So, yeah, that's... but he tried. It's the thought that counts, right? He tried. There was a few other scenes where he cares about her. Like, there was a scene during Alabasta where, he was teamed up with Nami, and then they were going to face off against Mrs. Doublefinger and Mr. One. And, of course, Zoro had to fight Mr. One, and Nami had to kind of run off on her own to deal with Mrs. Doublefinger, and Zoro was concerned about her. But perhaps he had enough faith that she could maybe do it. One of the funnier scenes, and this was, I believe, anime only. I don't think this was in the manga. It was during Punk Hazard, and it was when Sanji was in Nami's body, like Sanji sexy time, and they're running through the snow, and Sanji's just having fun in Nami's body, blah blah blah. Like, oh, they're so bouncy, but then she trips and falls, and there's this scene where Zoro, like, because he has an intense rivalry with I can't say that word, rivalry with Sanji. We'll get to that. But it's Nami's body, so she's about to trip and fall, and you have this moment where Zoro reaches out and grabs her, and they're just like this moment where they're holding each other's hands, and Brook's there, and he's like, ooh, and they eventually just like fuck off. But it was a funny scene, and I think that ignited a lot of fanfics with that. But yeah, that's probably the most with them came with the Arlong Park arc when Zoro and Nami had their, interchange here, and Zoro's like, calls her a bitch basically, and how dare you do this to the crew. But eventually he realizes what's going on, and they're on a good relationship since then. Although, his actions maybe annoy Nami every now and then, but no more so than the other members of the crew, really. Next up we have Usopp. Now, Usopp's relationship to Zoro. that I touched upon in the Usopp video, Usopp looks at Zoro as like, this is a brave man of the sea. This is a guy that's a badass, along with all the other members of the crew, like, you know, like Sanji and Luffy as well. But Zoro is one of them. He's a really strong fighter, and I can imagine Usopp looks up to him and wants to be like Zoro someday. The most of their relationship, though, that really their interaction was during Enies lobby. As I stated, there was the moment where Zoro was like, you're not just going to bring him back to the crew just on a half-hearted, you know, hey guys, I was joking around. No, he's going to apologize, you're not bringing him back, and if you do bring him back, then I won't acknowledge you as a captain, I'll leave. So, he doesn't hate Usopp, he does view him as a friend, it's just, it's more about Luffy's status as a captain, which I already said, like, you can't have this shit going on as a captain, you need to really put up or shut up in these kind of situations. But Zoro did want him to come back, and after he did come back, there was no bad blood between them. It wasn't like Zoro was looking at Usopp like, yeah, you freaking tack back to our captain there. It wasn't anything like that. The funniest scene with them was during their fight with Jabra and Kaku, when Usopp, you know, being Usopp, ends up handcuffing him and Zoro together, and so, oh shit, how are we gonna fight now? And so the only thing that Zoro could come up with was, well, his first idea was, alright, we're gonna play rock, paper, scissors, and whoever loses is gonna cut off their hand. Because Zoro don't care. That's actually happened a few times in the story where Zoro is like getting ready to mutilate himself if it means that he'll be able to fight. When he was on Little Garden, he was trapped in Mr. Three's wax, you know, candle special presentation thing, and his whole body was turning to wax and his feet were locked in. You know, he was getting ready just to like cut off his freaking legs, which he did. He got about halfway through before he stopped, and then just jumped down and fight without feet. You know, he was willing to do that. So kind of, that's the kind of guy he is. But the other idea that they had before lopping off their hands, and Zoro's like, all right, I have another idea. So Zoro's a pretty strong guy. He does a lot of upper body, you know, does a lot of, he lifts, bro, he lifts. So he takes one of his swords, Yubashiri, and then he gives it to Usopp to hold. So Usopp holds Yubashiri like this, and then he just, like, wraps a cloth around Usopp, and then he just lifts Usopp's entire body up. And like, you are the great long nose blade, or something like that now. And it's just Usopp holding Yubashiri, and Usopp's like saying like the onomatopoeias for sounds, like shing, shing, cut. I'm like, oh my god. But yeah, that was a pretty funny scene there. And that's pretty much scenes we get with Usopp. There's other scenes where Zoro will basically tell Usopp to, like, okay, Usopp, time to man up, time to do this shit, get going. Like, once again, during Arlong, you know, Zoro didn't do that himself, but there was a moment when Usopp was about to give up and about to fake being dead in order to get out of a fight, and then he remembered, like, Zoro and Sanji and Usopp, those guys, I mean, Zoro, Sanji, and Luffy, those guys are all fighting, and I can't be here bleeding out. I can't be here pretending to bleed out. I got to get on this. And so it serves as like a motivational factor to get up. You know, Usopp wants to be a brave warrior of the sea, and Zoro kind of is. So, yeah, that's relationship there. Next up is Sanji, and I don't think there's much of a relationship between Zoro and Sanji, so we can honestly just skip that. Okay, moving on to Chopper. Okay, no. Okay, so, they weren't always rivals. I don't think they really always had a good, a like for each other, but they weren't always rivals. During pretty much all of the East Blue, they got along fairly well, but it wasn't until Little Garden where the rivalry really got kicked into high gear. So Zoro and Sanji participate in a hunting contest, you know, who can kill the bigger, like, dinosaur, basically. And, you know, I think Zoro captured a Triceratops, and Sanji killed, like, a Tyrannosaurus Rex kind of thing, and they were looking at them side by side, and they're all trying to debate, like, which one's bigger? Which one's bigger? No, mine's bigger. No, mine's bigger. So, you can take that whatever you will, you know, metaphor for something? I don't know. I think it just comes down to the fact they're both the same age. They're both 19 years old before the time skip. They're both 21 after the time skip, and they're seen as, like, you know, they just want to prove, like, I'm stronger than you, you're stronger than me. You know, it's just you know, boys will be boys kind of thing. It just gets brought to a whole new level. They're not stupid, though. If they're in the middle of a fight with somebody, they're not going to bicker. You know, if they're like, oh, shit, we're about to all be defeated by Kizaru and Kuma and that Sentomaru sumo guy. Okay, Sanji, now it's a time to bicker back and forth. No, they don't act like that. When shit hits the fan, they're ready to go, and they're ready to fight side by side, and they're ready to even do some collaboration attacks with each other, as they did with the PX4. They all pulled their power, and they managed to just strike that thing, Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji all together with, like, their strongest attacks. So, but it's when they're on the ship and when they're just walking around town like that, it's sort of like comic relief, especially whenever they have, like, their nicknames for each other. In fact, I don't think either Sanji or Zoro have ever actually referred to each other, by their actual names. At least I don't think Zoro has ever called Sanji by his name. Perhaps Sanji said Zoro's name before, but I don't think Zoro ever said Sanji's name before. He'll always call him like, hey, dartboard brow or arrow cook, or perverted cook or whatever like that. And then Sanji will counter with fucking Marimo or Moss Head or something like that. So it's kind of funny, they get along there, and they just you need a rival. You need a rival to be the best like no one ever was, and that's a neat little dichotomy they have going on there, and they have their differences and things like that. So yeah, it's more like a brotherly bond. They'll bicker from time to time, and they'll be like, fuck you, but really at the end of the day, they need each other. And I know this is starting to sound a little bit like yaoi, so we're gonna move on from this. But what do I know? There's no yaoi of Zoro and Sanji out on the internet. I mean, come on, now don't Google search it. Don't Google search it. Trust me, it's there. Okay, so next up is Zoro and Chopper. Now, a running gag that Chopper has with Zoro is, of course, Chopper's the doctor, and Zoro is involved in a lot of fights in the story, so he usually ends up getting banged up pretty bad. Before a lot of the major injuries happened actually, though, before Chopper joined the crew. You had the scene with Mihawk slicing Zoro upside the freaking chest, and there was the doctor in Kokoyashi Village that actually had to patch him up there, and then he cuts off his freaking, almost gets like halfway through cutting off his freaking legs during Little Garden. I'm not really sure how they patched that up, because the next time we see him on Drum Island, his legs are already healed. I'm like, okay, damn, but alright, I guess you heal fast. But after Chopper joins the crew, Zoro is one of his, all prime patients whenever they get into an intense fight. Usually Chopper will wrap Zoro up in bandages and tell him, like, okay, not to move, take your medicine, blah, blah, blah. And then what does Zoro do? As soon as he wakes up, he'll rip off all the bandages, grab some fucking sake, and just be like, yeah, I took them off because they were annoying. I couldn't walk around with them. This is the only medicine I need. Glug, glug, glug. Chopper's like, oh my god, you're a fucking idiot. Most of the time, they don't really interact all that well, except during Skypiea. That was the big one. So Chopper was defeated by Ohm through the ordeal of iron, and this was a really interesting moment, going into Zoro, because Zoro doesn't, maybe it's because of the Bushido idea, or maybe it's because of the way that he feels like a true swordsman can't let his emotions run him, but Ohm asks Zoro, are you going to fight me for revenge for Chopper? I defeated one of your crew members. Are you going to fight me for revenge? And Zoro's response to that was basically like, I don't like to fight for revenge. That's not what I do. I don't like to fight for that reason. But in that situation, I think he was going to. Kind of similar later on when Robin gets electrocuted by Eneru. And Zoro was like, you did that to a woman. So in that case, he was going to, try to fight in terms of revenge. But I understand where Zoro was coming from. In order to really, be a true swordsman that's really effectual on the field of combat. Try to remove your emotions. Don't fight for revenge or those like very selfish emotions like that. Try to clear your mind, and that's how you would win a fight. But in that situation, he also cares very deeply for his crewmates, and that's why he was so pissed off after Ohm defeated Chopper like that. Particularly because Chopper's one of the weaker members of the crew at that point. So right, makes sense why he would get a little pissed off by that. But I don't think there was many more of the moments like that with Zoro and Chopper. So moving on to Robin. So this was an interesting one. Zoro did not trust Robin as far as he could throw her. And Zoro's a pretty buff guy. He could probably throw Robin pretty damn far. But after she joins the crew, and she basically bribes, or, Sanji's love-struck with her, and she just uses her powers to kind of convince Luffy and Chopper that she's fun to be around, and then she bribes Nami. Zoro's the only one on the crew that's like, I don't trust you, lady. I wish this would have maybe gone somewhere. It doesn't really go much of anywhere. There's no moments in Skypiea where Zoro is like really distrusting of Robin or anything like that. During Water 7, when the events of, Inna's Lobby get started and Robin gets recruited into CP9 and the events occur where she shoots, Iceberg and everything like that, Zoro, I think there's a line of dialogue where Zoro's like, I know she was bad news, or I know I didn't trust her that much. But even so, he doesn't disregard her. He still views her as a member of the crew, or at least goes along with Luffy's, understanding that she's a member of the crew, and goes and tries to rescue her. The same with everybody else, even despite not knowing her for all that long. So there was really no big moment that really made Zoro, skew over to Robin as like, I don't trust you, lady. And then there's like some event and he's like, okay, you're cool. Maybe you could say something that happened on Sky Island or something like that, just because they've been around for each other long enough, and it's just like, oh, okay, she's cool. But I feel like there should have been maybe a little bit more of a big event that occurred here. It's pretty much just like, he doesn't trust Robin, and then Water 7 happens, events occur that really should make you think, like, I told you so, we shouldn't have trusted her, look what happened. But Luffy's like, no, 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 she wouldn't have done that, even though we don't know her that well. Luffy's a little bit naive. He's like, let's go and save her, though, from being executed. And Zoro's like, okay, she's cool, I'll go risk my life for her. So it might just be more of just, taking up Luffy's status as the captain, but honestly, after that, he doesn't really, he treats her the same as every other member of the crew, and is entirely cool with her. And like I said, during the Skypiea arc, when Eneru electrocutes her, Zoro is like, he's not as chivalrous as, like, Sanji, but he's like, that was a woman, right? Like, I'm gonna freaking cut you for that. And then Eneru's like, a woman? Why should I give a shit if she was a woman? And that, you could tell that pissed Zoro off. Perhaps because of his relationship with Kuina. How Kuina was, a woman who always, like... But, in that case, though, Kuina was a woman that always, like, cursed the fact that she was a woman, because that she was going to be weaker than Zoro just inherently because of her gender. And so you think Zoro would have grown up thinking, like, no, it doesn't have anything to do with gender. You can be a woman and still be badass, But maybe he never had that mentality of it, and does treat women as just inherently weaker or something like that. I'm not sure. Maybe a feminist could analyze Zoro for me. I'm not an expert in that subject. So with that being the case, I'm gonna move on now. Franky is probably the member of the Straw Hat crew that Zoro doesn't interact with the most and don't really have much of a relationship with. They're cool with each other. Obviously, Franky was an enemy at first. He was an antagonist, when he beat up Usopp. Luffy, Sanji, Chopper, and Zoro go beat up the freaking Franky family. So, obviously, Zoro viewed him as an enemy back then, but after the events of Enies Lobby, and more notably after the events of Thriller Bark, when Franky really witnesses how strong Zoro is when fighting against Ryuma, and even though Franky's kind of he has a bit of an ego. He's not super arrogant, but, he has his moments where he'll pose and be like, I'm awesome, I'm super strong. But he'll even admit, Zoro, you're stronger than I am. And I think there was a little bit of discrepancy between, like, he's like, we should call each other, you should call me bro, and Zoro's like, I'm never calling you that. So, yeah, that's pretty much all there is there. They don't really have much of an interaction now that I actually think about it. Even after the time skip, I don't really think there's any moments where they really fight alongside each other or anything. I mean, he was present during the fight with Ryuma during Thriller Bark, but he didn't really do anything to help out the fight. It was pretty much just Zoro versus Ryuma there. And then Franky and Brook, they were just kind of standing there watching and being in awe of Zoro's strength. But yeah, I don't think there's anything really much more to ask about Franky. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think really the talk much or really do anything beyond the time skip. His relationship with Brook, of course, after they actually hear the story about Brook and Laboon, Zoro begins to think about him a little bit more than just like that annoying skeleton guy that most of the crew viewed Brook as at first, to be honest with you. Later on, it's revealed that Brook is also a swordsman. He's another swordsman on the Straw Hat crew, not obviously as strong as Zoro, but so I feel like there's a little bit of things they have at least in common there that, I don't know, they could talk about occasionally, like, hey Zoro, hey Brook, so I got this new sword, it was sharpened by the Long Arm tribe, it's pretty cool, you want to have like a sparring match or something? And Zoro's like, all right, but I'm gonna have to, I'm not gonna go easy on you. I know, something like that. I don't know. Just, I wish we would have seen, honestly, I want to see more interaction between the Straw Hats on the ship. Am I the only one that wants to see that? Like, Oda can give us, like, I don't know, like, maybe 1 or 2 chapters and we just, like, see different moments. I mean, the anime does this fairly well. I mean, they'll go around and actually do this in the anime way more than in the manga. But I don't think we get to see a lot of the interactions between the Straw Hats while they're on the ship and really expand the relationships that way. Like, even if you want to give us just 1 chapter and it's kind of just like after the Straw Hats all get back together, which will probably be for a while because we got Totland to finish up and then Reverie and then after Wano and after, probably when they get to Wano, that's when all the Straw Hats will regroup and then... But just give us, like, a chapter where, like, the day in the life of the Straw Hat crew, where we, like, this is what Luffy and Zoro are like, this is what Sanji and Zoro do, this is Sanji and Nami, something like that, I don't know. Just give us a few chapters like that every now and then, or maybe even cover pages, that would work even better. But, yeah, don't really have much of a relationship with Brook beyond just after hearing about Laboon and feeling rather, upset, not upset, but feeling, it's like, okay, this is, I understand where this skeleton is coming from, that's, it's a real noble quest there to be reunited with his whale buddy, and that they're both swordsmen. There was a moment where after Zoro made his sacrifice on Thriller Bark, Brook was there, and Brook and Sanji were the only two people that really witnessed him do this. I forgot to mention that, but Sanji was the one that stepped up to Kuma after Zoro did and tried to get Kuma to take his head, but Zoro just, hits him in the freaking rib cage with his swords and just knocks him out, and he's like, okay, you were saying you're taking my head, right? But Brook witnessed it too, so Brook obviously has a lot of admiration for Zoro. And then, of course, you have the moment at the end of Thriller Bark where Brook is sitting there in front of the Rumbar Pirates Monument, playing the violin, and then Zoro takes Yubashiri, who, the sword that was destroyed by Shu, and sets it to rest on Thriller Bark, and he asks Brook, allow me to, lay my sword to rest here. It's a dead sword, Yubashiri. And so you have this moment where Zoro's sitting down praying, in Yubashiri, and then they talk about, I joined the crew, and Zoro's like, oh, okay, it's a crazy bunch. I hope you're ready for it. So that was a very touching scene. I like that. Also, it's interesting that he would do that. He sets the sword down and just kind of like, prays, because Zoro doesn't believe in God. Yeah, Zoro's an atheist. Zoro, during the events of Skypiea, when all the members of Sky Island were talking about, oh, that's God's island, that's where God lives. And Zoro's just like, God, huh? No. And then Chopper's like, don't you believe in God? And Zoro's like, nope. Like, if you want to, it's fine, but I've just never seen any evidence for it. Probably more of a guy that's just like, I only believe what my sword can cut, kind of shit. It's funny, though, because a lot of his techniques revolve around Buddhism. Buddhism doesn't believe in a god. There's no god. Well, it depends on which context. Some contexts will actually set up the Buddha as an actual deity. Others do not. But that's just an interesting, comparison there. He doesn't believe in God, and yet a lot of his techniques are named after the site. One of his techniques is like the crossing of the six paths, which is like a cycle of samsara in Buddhism. So he's probably very spiritual. He's spiritual, just doesn't believe in maybe a monotheistic deity or a higher power or something like that. So speaking of Zoro's techniques, my butt's getting very sore. Speaking about Zoro's techniques, we're going to go and spotlight each one of his swords here. I already made a video about this earlier this week, going into the different Meito grades of swords, so you can go check that out up here. That'll actually explain, the different ranks of the swords and what they mean and everything like that. So, the first sword that he's shown in the story that he uses, Zoro uses a style called Santoryu, which is 3-sword style. We've seen other characters in the story use Yontoryu, 4-sword style. Hachi had 6-sword style, but Zoro's primary method is Santoryu. So he puts one sword in his mouth, and then he has the other two in his hands, and then all of his techniques, or his Santoryu techniques, revolve around that. However, Zoro, having 3 swords, also uses Nitoryu, 2-sword style, and Itoryu, 1-sword style. So this is his first sword that is seen in the story that is any relevance. This is Wado Ichimonji, which is an Owazumono sword. There's only 21 in this grade in the world. This was the sword that was used by his childhood friend Kuina. Kuina and him grew up in the same dojo, and they practiced constantly, and Zoro always lost to her, like 2,000 times in a row. And then finally, though, Kuina decided that she, being a woman, would not be able to surpass Zoro, who's a man. Zoro is going to be inherently stronger than she is. So, depending on which version you read, Kuina either fell down the stairs and died, or she was defeated by a rival from another dojo and decided just to give up her goal of becoming a great swordsman. There's problems with both of those, although I don't think Kuina's alive. I still think there's problems with both of those. And I think she killed herself, basically. That's what happened there. Which is kind of fucked up when you consider she's a little kid, but whatever. Anyway, after she passed away, she gave Wado Ichimonji and went back to her father. Her father, Koshiro, was the leader of the dojo. And so Zoro had to basically beg for the Wado Ichimonji from him. That, keep in mind, Zoro's only a little kid here, but he wants to fulfill the dream that Kuina and Zoro both had to become the greatest swordsman in the world. And he's like, and I'm sure Kuina would have wanted Zoro to have the Wado for, that's probably what she wanted. And so Koshiro gives him Wado Ichimonji to fulfill that goal. So it's treasure. It's basically the same as Luffy's Strawhat is his Wado Ichimonji. So if it would ever break, that would be a really big thing on Zoro. Zoro also carried around at the beginning of the story 2 unnamed katanas. We never knew the relevance of them. They were broken by Mihawk, which necessitated him getting 2 more blades in Logtown that we'll get to. During the first part of the series, Zoro tended to use this sword with his Itoryu techniques, his 1-sword style. He would always break out Wado. Whenever he uses Santoryu, he always keeps this sword in his mouth, which which I will attempt to do here, but I have to keep the sheath up so I don't, like, chip my fucking tooth. Like, I don't know. He also can talk with that being in his mouth, too, so it takes skill. It takes skill to master Santoryu. Part of it is actually keeping it in your mouth. The other part is actually cutting people down with it with enough force. And the other part is being able to speak coherently with it in. It takes decades of training here. So, decades of training, and he's only 21. Why? Because he's Zoro. He can fit 1 decade of training into 2 years. He's Zoro, damn it. So, yeah, that's that. And when, like, techniques he uses with this one are like Lion's Song. The technique he used to defeat Mr. One. That's like his one sword style technique one. Yeah. And but later on though in the story he seems to not use this too much. When he used Lion's Song against Kuma in Thriller Bark, I think he used Kitetsu for that, and then after he got Shusui from Ryuma, he tends to use Shusui a little bit more for his one sword style techniques. Like when he cut the galleon in half, he used Shusui for that. Maybe just because maybe Shusui is just a more durable blade. They're both in the same class, but maybe like Shusui is just more durable, and that minimizes the risk to damaging this because this is something he values above all the other swords he has. But yeah, that's the Wado, probably going to have this throughout the rest of the story. Means Road to Harmony, pretty basic sword, just a pure white blade. I think it fits Zoro rather well, considering he goes with a black aesthetic a lot of times. The bandana he wears is black. I know this one is green, but whatever. Yeah, so that's Wado there. Next up is, let's see, we'll go with Kitetsu. So this is one of the swords he gets in Logtown from Ippon Matsu. This is a Wazumono rank. There are an undetermined amount of these, but they're the lowest of the named ranks. This blade is cursed. Alright, and I already went into that in the video, but basically he gets this one by tossing it up in the air and testing Zoro's good luck compared to the sword's curse. And Zoro won out, and he managed to get the sword for free, and he also gets Yubashiri by the shop owner. Kitetsu is used with Yubashiri whenever Zoro uses his Nitoryu or two-sword style techniques. He usually keeps Wado sheathed and uses his other 2 swords for Nitoryu. Let's see, there was a scene during Water 7 when he's trapped in a chimney and he uses this one to free. Like, he can kind of, like, sense the presence of this sword because it's cursed. During Whiskey Peak, when he was trying out this sword for the first time, it seemed to be, you know, very bloodthirsty, as the Kitetsu swords are, and he was cutting people down that he didn't want it to cut. You know, it was like, a good sword needs to listen to its master. Oh, you're going to be a problem child. But after a while, Zoro seems to have reined it in. So that's Kitetsu there. He still has it. There's 2 other Kitetsus too. There's Nidai Kitetsu and Shodai Kitetsu. Nidai Kitetsu being on the same level as Wado and Shusui, and Shodai Kitetsu being on the same level as Mihawk's Yoru, the highest rank of sword possible. So perhaps Zoro will, maybe it's something with Wano, because we're getting to Wano. Maybe a Shodai Kitetsu or Nidai Kitetsu will be in Wano, and Zoro might upgrade his Kitetsu sword a bit. So that's one thing there. Next up is the other sword he gets from the shop. This is a Ryu Wazumono grade sword. This is Yubashiri, which is probably my favorite sword that Zoro's ever had. I just love the aesthetic of it. The sheath in the manga is a little bit more elaborate than this. This is just a standard black sheath. But the design of the sword itself, you know, little image there and little thing, and I just like the guard, you know, simple cross guard, but I like that. And the blade itself is very nice indeed. These are not sharp. These are just replicas. Oh my god! No, I'm just kidding. These are just replicas I got off Amazon. As part of a set. You can buy each one of these probably for like $30 each, $35 each plus shipping on Amazon if you want. I know a lot of people were asking me where you got these from, but they are real metal, so that's one thing. Pretty cool. This sword was destroyed by Shu, the marine captain that had the ability of the rust fruit during Eni's lobby. It was reduced to rusted scrap, and so Zoro laid it to rest on Thriller Bark after he got his next sword. So during Thriller Bark, Zoro had to rely on his Nitoryu style because he didn't have 3 swords. But he still carried Yubashiri around with him just because he was used to having 3 on his hip. Next up is Shusui. So this blade is an Wazumono rank, the same rank as Wado here. And he got this one from the Samurai of Wano, Ryuma. So during Thriller Bark, Ryuma was reanimated as a zombie by Dr. Hogback using Moria's shadow powers. They basically grave robbed Ryuma, who was this... Ryuma actually appeared in a manga that Oda did before One Piece, titled Monsters. It was like a one-shot thing, and Ryuma was this wandering samurai. And I don't think he used Shusui in that series, but so they changed some stuff around. But it's cool that Ryuma was introduced into One Piece, and so I guess Dr. Hogback infiltrated Wano, stole the fucking Shusui blade and the corpse, and then reanimated him. Zoro fought against Ryuma fair and square, and after the fight, Zoro sets him on fire using his blaze technique, and then Ryuma, while he's like on fire, like sheaths his blade and is like, the body of this samurai's story ends, but this blade's shall not. And he like tosses it to Zoro, and Zoro just grabs it like that, and he's just like, yep. So that's how he got a sword. It's a lot more heavy and tough than Yubashiri was, and so Zoro had to compensate for that a bit. But like I said, he pretty much uses Shusui a lot more now than he did at the beginning of the, uses Shusui more as like the one sword style techniques now after the time skip, which I admit, pretty badass sword. I mean, it's a black sword. I mean, come on, black and red. It's got a cool fucking sheath, and it's got a flower pattern. I mean, damn, it's pretty cool, man. Yeah. So those are Zoro's swords. I'm not going to go into every single technique he's done because he's had a shit ton of them, although his signature technique at the beginning of the story was his onigiri technique. That's when he uses Santoryu and launches an attack with that. Doesn't really use it that much later on throughout the story. He used it in the Fishman Island arc, and it was like renamed Purgatory Onigiri. But after that, he doesn't really use it all that much, despite it being like his signature technique at the beginning of the story. His strongest technique as of right now is his Ichidai Sansen Dai Sensekai technique, his greater 3,000 worlds. It requires all three of his blades together. He does like this twirling pattern, and then, a full power one with Haki imbued. So he learned how to use Haki from Mihawk, and then he can implant, so all swords could be his black swords, the same as Shusui and Yoru, Mihawk's blade, and managed to cut down Pika, who was like the size of a mountain, and I'm not meaning that like figuratively. He was literally a giant mountain guy made of rock, and Zoro was able to cut him in half. So, multiple times. So, yeah, don't fuck with Zoro, please. It's not a good idea. It's not gonna end well. It's just not. On top of that, there's some other situational techniques that he can use. During my least favorite arc of the story, the Davy backfight, he used a technique called no sword style. He wasn't allowed weapons, so he had to, like, compensate. He's trained his muscles severely, so even though he doesn't have swords, if he focuses and, gets his muscles going, he can, like, send people flying with just hits from his hands. I think in Film Gold, he used this again. He had his hands charged up with armament Haki and then used no sword style again, so it can actually be used in combat as a serious fucking technique. So that's pretty cool. I hope he actually uses that in the story, because that's pretty smart. Kyutoryu, his 9-sword style. We don't get to see that anymore. I really wish we would get to see that. So during his fight with Kaku, I guess he calls it his demon aura, and then he can just, like, boom, he can, like, produce the illusion of two other Zoros, so that would be, like, 9 swords. Now, whether or not, you can call this Haki, you can call it Zoro's a demon, you could call it an illusion, you can call, like, he's moving so fast it looks like there's 9 swords. You can do whatever you want, buddy. I don't even care at this point. It just looks cool. But other people can clearly see this illusion, so I would say it has something to do with Haki, at least in some respect. Zoro wants to be the king of, wants to be, not the king of the king of the swordsmen. Zoro wants to be the best swordsman in the world, so I could see him possibly getting Conqueror's Haki, and I could maybe see this as an extension of Conqueror's Haki. I mean, sure. Whatever you want to use to make sense of this crazy 9-sword style technique, whatever, go for it. Zoro's been involved in some of the most intense battles in the story. Usually how it goes is that Luffy will take on the big bag of the arc, and Zoro will take on the leading commander, or the second in command, or the strongest one right after that one. So, for instance, in Dressrosa, he fights against Pika. In Alabasta, he fights against Mr. 1, who's directly below Mr. 0. So I'm just going to go over the major battles here. His first battle was against Morgan, after Luffy frees him. And a lot of times Zoro always has a handicap when he fights. You ever notice that? Like, he was starved to death almost when, fighting Morgan, and he still beat him. He got stabbed by Buggy that one time when he found out, he didn't know about Buggy's devil fruit. So he's usually encumbered in some ways to kind of, like, limit his power, because he's super badass. You got to make sure that he can't just kill the enemy in one hit, right? What's funny, though, I guess not really funny, depends on your sense of humor. I have a dark sense of humor. Zoro will actually kill people. Unlike Luffy. Luffy doesn't kill people because he feels like, me defeating them, will give them another shot at, fulfilling their dreams or something like that. Or when I kill them, their dreams are dead. So defeating them and having their dreams be destroyed, it's the same thing as being dead, but they can try again. Zoro will just straight up kill you if you piss him off enough, and it's been stated before that he has actually killed people before in the past. He killed the former Mr. Seven of Baroque Works before the series started. He ripped off Wicked Dick's dicks. That's pretty messed up there. And when he was encountering a celestial dragon in Sabaody, you know, he had this moment of like bloodlust on his face where if Jory Bonnie didn't stop him, he would have cut down Saint Charlos, and he would probably killed him, and probably would have resulted in the same, you know, the same outcome as Luffy did when he punched him, but his head would be a few feet from his body in that case. His first big battle in the story, which was also ironically one where he lost, was his fight against Mihawk at the Baratie. This fight served to more like show his goal, his ambition, what he has to strive for, and also Oda had to show off the really badass characters, of course. So he fights against Mihawk, not really much of a fight. Mihawk stops his onigiri technique with like a little fucking pocket blade, and it's not even until Zoro really announces why he's doing this. He made a promise to somebody, and then he won't back down. That's when Mihawk decides that he isn't just amongst the other riffraff. He's worth fighting. And so Mihawk unsheaths his black sword, Yoru, and fights Zoro. Zoro uses his strongest technique, 3,000 worlds, but just fails miserably and is cut down by Mihawk. You know, he does the epic moment. It's like, the scars on the back are a swordsman's shame. Mihawk's just like, all right, and just cuts him down. And so that was his first major loss, and one of the only times you see Zoro crying. I think the only time in the story you see him crying. He's like holding Wano up to the sky, the only sword that didn't get broken by Mihawk, and he's like, "I will be the straightest swordsman. I'll never lose again. Is that okay, King of the Pirates?" And Luffy's like, "Yep, it's good." So yeah, that was a very emotional moment. Probably right next to the moment with Kuma as Zoro's like shining moment in the story. So that's that. His fight with Mr. One taught him a little bit about hockey. Understanding the voices of all things, learning about observation, you know, finding out where his sword was and how to cut through steel. So that was a big fight for him. His big fight on Skypiea was against Ohm. How I said he was kind of in a revenge fight against, because Ohm defeated Chopper. Although there was another fight he had in Skypiea that I have to mention, and that was his fight against Braum from the Shandora tribe. And that was a cool one because Braum used guns, like flash guns, and Zoro... he got shot a few times, and he was like noticing how distracted he was, how serious he has to be in a fight, and this is where he developed the technique of the flying sword technique. So, depending on how many swords he utilizes, he can actually send out a wave of, like, air pressure, like a bullet or an energy blast, I guess, like, if you want to liken it to, like, DBZ or something, to actually damage his opponent. So, when he uses one sword, it's the 36-pound-a-hoe. It's two swords, it's the 72-pound-a-hoe, and with three swords, it's the 108-pound-a-hoe, or 108 caliber Phoenix, whatever translation you want to use. After the time skip, he can upgrade them to, like, 360-pound Phoenix, 720-pound Phoenix, 1,080-pound Phoenix, you know, adding the greater powers there. These are also numbers that are very relevant in Buddhist mythology. The first battle, along with one of the first battles where they actually heavily lose, like they just, have no chance of winning, was against Aokiji, of course. The same thing with Sanji and Luffy, how they all lose that fight, and they understand pretty quickly that there's no way they can actually beat them. Luffy stays behind to fight Aokiji, while Zoro and Sanji have to recover that. Zoro has his arm frozen, Sanji had his leg frozen. But after they heal, they're ready to go and help Luffy with the fight. So even though they know they can't win, they understand they have to at least help their captain. During Eni's lobby, I already said he fought Kaku, and that's where he revealed his Q-Toryu, his 9-sword style. Thriller Bark, he fought against Ryuma. That's where he got Shusui there. During after the fight with Ryuma, after the end of Thriller Bark, when he sacrificed himself and took all the pain and injury onto himself, from Kuma, he is severely injured after this, and even after he heals up, even by the time the Sabaody rings around, he's still heavily injured from this. So they just barely managed to defeat the PX4, and then Zoro is faced with, like, Kizaru and almost gets killed by Kizaru, almost gets killed by another pacifista. Finally, he's sent flying by Kuma, Kuragana Island, or the Muggy Kingdom, where he lands, and this is the same place Perona got sent, so there's also a little bit of relationship there between him and Perona. It's more of annoyance at times, but they seem to be getting along fairly well, and a lot of fanfictions through that as well. I like Perona. Perona's pretty cool. Anyway, he arrives there, and this is the same, just by happen chance, this is the same island where Mihawk was deciding to live, and also a race of deadly baboons that can use weapons called the human drills live. So Zoro spent the time skip learning how to fight against these human drills and defeating them, learning about Haki from Mihawk. We don't know everything that Mihawk taught him. I would like to think that he didn't teach him everything about it, and I like to think that Zoro and Mihawk did not directly fight. It was through a lot more like other methods on how Mihawk trained him. Like, for instance, when he was training him about Haki, Mihawk told him that you are forbidden from touching alcohol until you've mastered this. So Mihawk understood how to get to Zoro, and I would imagine Zoro mastered Haki in like 2 days flat. It took Luffy like a year. No, it took Zoro like 2 days, in order to get the booze back again. So I think it's more of like that, how Mihawk trained Zoro, because they're still gonna fight at some point in the story to become like the title of true swordsman. True greatest swordsman in the world, so it would make sense why it would make sense why they would fight there, and even if it was just a sparring match. I mean, come on now. So that's I like to think what happened there. After the time skip, it's very clear that his power got a huge boost. He was able to cut a galleon in half, which was the same thing that Mihawk did when he was first introduced, and he was able to cut down Hody, which was the main antagonist of the arc. So it's very clear here that, if it wasn't for that energy steroid shit, if it was just like a regular member of the pirates, then the New Fishman pirates, then Zoro could have easily just killed their leader right there. Even though they were in the water, Zoro. So that was a cool way that Oda did that. He didn't want to seem like, well, Hody might be the strongest member of the New Fishman pirates and Luffy's going to take him out, but Zoro wouldn't struggle against him in his normal form. So even after he gets doped up on the energy steroids, Zoro probably could have taken his ass, no problem. And he was the only one that could actually see his, he had observation Haki at that point too, so he can, see his water bullets and he can, deflect them with his sword. That was a pretty cool moment. During the fight at the end of the New Fishman Pirates, he fights against Hyozu, which is the greatest swordsman on the island, who's also doped up with the energy steroids, but Zoro takes him out, no problem, really. And then there's that. During Punk Hazard, he cuts a fucking dragon's head off, so there's that. And he fights against Monet. Amazing scene where he leads Tashigi to do it. And Tashigi is having problems, so Zoro just walks in, and there's this moment where he doesn't regard Monet as a serious threat, and Monet's like, I thought you said you weren't going to get involved, and Zoro has the cool moment, his theme's playing in the background too, and it's just like, have you ever known a wild animal that you knew for a fact would never bite? And Monet's like, ah. And Zoro takes out Shusui, one sword style, doesn't use Haki, great dragon shock, and just cuts her in fucking half. And he doesn't kill her because he wasn't using Haki, and Monet was a Logia, so she could just turn into snow. But just the fact that she would have died if he did use Haki, and he was that stronger than her. Monet can't reconstitute herself, and she's just this. So that was an awesome moment where he just uses intimidation to just take her out. It's pretty cool. During Dressrosa, he fights against Pika. More of an annoying fight for Zoro than an actual test of his strength. I mean, he uses Haki to fight Pika, but Pika's technique was just so goddamn annoying, the ability to assimilate into rocks, that Zoro is just like, oh my god, come on. He fights him like 3 times, and every time it's like, oh, I'm gonna leave now. Ooh. And then Zoro's like, you freaking bastard. So he's chasing him all around Dressrosa. Finally, he manages to cut him. Like, Zoro gets onto the trick that he's using, and he can look and see with his one eye. Which, by the way, Zoro, he loses an eye during the time skip. If you want to know my theory about that, there you go. I don't necessarily think it's anything to do, really, like a demon eye or anything like that. Like, he's going to open it up. It's going to be like the fucking fuck you gone. But, it's not going to be anything relevant. But if you want, you check out the video there. But, using his eyesight, he can determine, like, oh, okay, I know what you're doing here, Pika. And eventually he defeats him. Even after Pika goes into his full body Haki, it's very clear that Zoro's stronger than him, so he probably didn't use all of his power in that fight. It was just such an annoying fight, and he had to use all these different methods to fight Pika. That's where the real trouble lied. So currently in the story, after Zoro heads out to Wano with Law and Kinemon and Kanjuro. They're going to go to Wano Kuni to try to free it from the grip of Kaido and the Shogun, who are working together. And I'm really pumped for it. I can't wait to Wano because there's going to be a lot of talk about swords, a lot of talk about. I hope that Shusui's brought up a lot. I hope there's a whole fucking just a few chapters where someone sees Zoro wielding Shusui, and then Zoro tells them the story about Ryuma, and then they go into the past of Ryuma and what he did. I hope there's a whole past arc with there's going to be, because in every One Piece chapter, and every One Piece arc, there's always a flashback arc. Like Totland had the flashback with Sanji. Dressrosa had a few. Dressrosa had the flashback with Law, had the flashback with Doflamingo, had the flashback with King Riku taking over the island. King Riku losing control of the island. Fishman Island had Otahime and Fisher Tiger. So I hope the flashback at Wano, whatever it's going to be focused on, is going to include Ryuma in a big way, and Shusui is a big part of that. And then also we get other swords that might get brought up, like the other Katetsus. A lot of other people are also talking about, hey, maybe Kuina is on Wano, which I think she's dead. Am I the only one thinking that she's just dead and she can serve as like a drive for Zoro to become stronger? Like for example, Robin's mother died, Bellamere died. Well, no, she was thrown in a dungeon, but I guess it's because it wasn't seen on we didn't actually see it happen. All we see with Kuina is her dead body with a towel over it, so she's probably still alive, but I don't think she is. Maybe Koshiro, though. Koshiro, who is the Kuina's father, master of the dojo, might have something to do, well, he definitely has something to do with the Revolutionary Army, but he also might show up, because we don't know what he's up to. We saw him during a cover page, but he might have something to do with Wano. That would be cool if we get to see him there. Or something like that, tying back to Zoro's past, because, Zoro's the swordsman. They're going to a country with a bunch of samurai and swordsmen. There has to be some big shit going on there. And fuck, maybe Zoro will be the one, if Luffy arrives on the island and Luffy's the one to take on Kaido, not take down Kaido, but take on Kaido, or maybe one of the calamities or something like that, maybe a rematch with Jack or something. Maybe Zoro could take on the Shogun of Wano Kuni, or Zoro can take on Jack. Fuck, Zoro can take Jack. Jack's a freaking idiot. He could take on Jack. Zoro versus Jack. What do you think about that? But yeah, that's coming up in the story. So right now, that's where Zoro is. Probably is already there. Going beyond that, I think I honestly covered a lot of the stuff I want to see Zoro in the future. I talked about his Conqueror's Haki. I hope he awakens that, if there's anybody that awakens that. He already has observation and armament. In terms of his sword style, I hope we get to see his 9-sword style again. I hope he upgrades from his Sandai Katetsu to the other Curse Blades. I at least hope they're mentioned, even if he doesn't use them. I hope we see them at some point. If Zoro got Shodai Katetsu, that would be really cool, because Shodai Katetsu is in the same rank as Mihawk's Blade. Ow, I stabbed myself on Katetsu again! Damn it! What is with this sword? Damn it! It's the second time, too. The blade isn't sharp, but the tip is. But if he gets Shodai Katetsu, we're talking about a sword that's in the same rank as Yoru, which would make Zoro fighting against Mihawk all the more badass. So I hope to see that in the future there. And then I talked about Wano, so that got us all cut up there. So, all cut up there. Yeah, see what I did there? Yeah. Oh, man, this was a long video. I must have been talking for over an hour now, easily. But it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun to go into this character. I love Zoro a lot, as you can probably see. I went, probably the one I spent the most money for so far on all this. But yeah, what do you guys think about Zoro? What do you think about his swords? What do you think about his techniques? What do you hope to see from him in the future? What do you think about his relationships? Just talk about how sexy he is. I don't know. Just go on. Just go crazy. Just go nuts. Last thing I guess I should mention is the bandana thing. Yeah, it's a green bandana here, although it is a black one in the manga. Whenever Zoro fights against a serious opponent, he takes the bandana and puts it around his head, and that's kind of his trademark. He currently has a bounty of 320 million. Just another random fact I'll throw in there. Although he doesn't use it during Dressrosa, so I guess he didn't consider Pico worthy opponent. You know what? I didn't either. Wait, no. He wore the bandana against Pika, but he didn't wear it against Ryuma. That's what I thought was weird. He didn't wear it against Ryuma, of all people, who was like a samurai that he really revered. So I don't know what was up with that. But maybe he felt because he was a zombie, it was like, you're not really the samurai, you're just his corpse. So maybe if Zoro, maybe there's a descendant of Ryuma living in Wano. Maybe he'll meet someone like that. Maybe Kuina will be alive. I don't think she is, but maybe. I don't know. It would be cool. But Wano's coming up later this year, so we're going to get some Zoro action later this year. So, yeah. Just keep in mind, there's the videos I made, the sword ranks and Zoro's eye theory and stuff like that you can check out. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Next up, another lover of the drink, actually, and one that I'm really excited for. I think we all are. Next discussion video is going to be our very own Nami Swan. God damn it. I gotta go get fitted for a bikini now, don't I? Alright. Hope you guys enjoyed. Tekking101, signing out.